Today we're going to be looking at the LG C4 on the right and the Samsung S90D on the left. These are both the premium tier but stepped down non-flagship OLEDs from Samsung and LG for 2024. I'll be looking at multiple aspects of their performance across a variety of content. Both TVs are calibrated, and most of what you're going to be seeing is in the calibrated modes. However, like right now, what you're seeing is the dynamic tone mapping on movie mode on the S90D, cinema home on the C4, and using dynamic tone mapping in settings like this is what allows the TVs to push their brightness higher on the content instead of showing what the content is supposed to be. This would typically be used for a bright room mode or someone's preference, of course. Also, we're going to switch off of this in a moment, but just wanted to show that even when the Samsung is in active tone mapping and the C4 is with dynamic tone mapping on, the C4 is brighter while also retaining more saturation. And if you were to purely go off of panel technology and measurements, the S90D being QD OLED and also measuring around 300 nits higher than the C4, that on paper wouldn't make sense, but it's just the way that each of these are tuned, and especially with the way the tone mapping is being done on each display. Now, I will have dedicated reviews for each of these TVs in the future with more detail into each one, talking about how they tone map, their measurements, and so on. So moving on now to SDR to show how bright SDR can be for people who like to turn up the SDR all the way for sports. They're about even with the C4, maybe a slight hair higher, especially with the saturation. And this is also after calibration, and in doing so you have to turn contrast on Samsung down to 38 in SDR to stop it from clipping. So I'm going to move over to gaming and talk about the gaming differences. Now we can see if we switch between game and another mode that there is a pretty substantial color difference on the C4. So there is not the same level of color luminance in game mode on it. And then also the way that you set up the tone mapping is going to play a role in how it looks as well. Gaming is one area where the S90D has an advantage with luminance, especially color luminance. However, I do want to also add that the game mode is less accurate than last year on Samsung. So on the S90C or S95C, after making many adjustments to game mode, you can get it somewhat reasonable, but it is still quite wildly inaccurate and oversaturated. So if you want accuracy with gaming, then the LG really is the better option. But if you want extra brightness and saturation and don't care about the accuracy, then you would want to get the Samsung. So you can see here I'm toggling through the different tone mapping options on the LG. So if you do a calibration with an HDR tone map upload through software like CalMan, then what it offers in the display here with the user menu settings no longer does anything. So cinema mode is what I calibrated, so using that professional tone mapping option wasn't going to change anything regardless what you set it to. However, switching between off and on, there's still a difference. And then if you are in game mode or any other modes, or you don't have a custom tone map upload, then for gaming you would adjust the 4000 mastering toggle, and the higher you set it, the brighter it's going to be, but the more highlights will get clipped. So you just find what you like. And then also, of course, there's still HGIG if you do use game mode. Now on the S90D, your only tone mapping options is static and active. If you turn on active, it's basically dynamic tone mapping on for the LG would be similar. So that's showing this right now where they're both overly brightened. I had the camera turned down there to show specifically the highlights, and now I just turned the camera back up so you can see more of what they look like with their dynamic tone mapping options turned on. Now, due to the reduced color luminance in the actual game mode on the C4, I would recommend using Cinema or Filmmaker or something like that, and then using the tone mapping set to off, turn on the professional toggle, and then set it to 100, and then set your games to 1000 nits. So either the console either Xbox or PS5 setting, or in games with sliders, 7 to 1000, and that'll get it to very closely mimic how HDIG looks while still having the full color brightness. Alright, next up I wanted to check for color banding or posterization, which the C4 does show a little bit more than the Samsung. This is pretty typical, and I am switching the white balance back and forth so that you can see how each one looks when the white balance is set per TV. And that's because when you use a camera to record both technologies, QD OLED and WRGB at the same time, WRGB is going to look more blue than it is, and QD OLED will look more reddish than it is. Alright, so then I wanted to check if there was any perceivable increased input lag difference at all not being in game mode. So I'm going to slow this down and see if there's any frame by frame difference between the Samsung and the LG, and this is with the LG in cinema mode. And this is of course with ALLM turned on with the game optimizer turned on. So, and there's really no difference with the input lag, so that is what I would recommend for the LG. For the Samsung, there's really a lot of changes that need to be made for game mode if you want it to be remotely accurate, and I will have a settings video for both TVs again in the near future. Now I'm showing in SDR game mode, with both of them having their brightness maxed out in SDR game mode. LG does not allow the peak brightness option to be used in SDR game mode, so the Samsung is notably brighter. However, it's not as much brighter as it used to be. The C4 is brighter than past LG C series in SDR game mode, but there definitely still is a difference. If that is a thing that you would want brighter SDR gaming for, then that's the Samsung. Alright, now I'm going to take a look at some movies, starting with some high graded content. And here we are seeing the C4 definitely getting brighter and retaining more saturation in these flames. And again, this is not something you would expect based on the measurements. There's something going on with the Samsung and its tone mapping, where it must be more aggressively tone mapping this year, causing more reduction in its luminance in bright highlights, so there's less impact. There's also many areas where you can see clipping of highlights early on the Samsung, and really it's just not using the panel's full capability. Even when it comes to bright colors, which again you would expect QD OLED to be, a walk-away winner, but that's really not happening. The C4 is holding on to saturation and getting brighter more so than the Samsung. Now we're going to look at dark scenes, and if you look at the back wall, you can see one of the issues though with LG, where there can be a glow or flicker, especially when there's a dark scene with candlelight, or the luminance is constantly fluctuating. However, we also do see more saturation again with the C4 in low luminance scenes. Looking at motion, the Samsung does seem to skip occasional frames. That is something that I've seen on Samsung for years. Nothing really seems to be changed. And with vertical panning, that's another area that Samsung seems to usually fall behind with motion compared to LG. And here this is with the dejutter or interpolation set to 1, the lowest setting on both of them. I'm now going to switch over to YouTube demos and just let them play. So out of the box accuracy for both of them. On the Samsung, it's better than before in some ways and worse in others. Now this year in filmmaker and movie mode, the color gamut will automatically be in BT 2020 like it should be, and BT 2020 is far more accurate than it used to be. However, EOTF does not track as well as it did last year and requires a little bit more adjustment. When it comes to the contrast setting, you can improve EOTF by reducing contrast to around 45. However, doing that does kind of kill the highlights. So somewhere around maybe 47, 48 might be a trade-off, something that you'll probably just want to play around with. It's kind of a no-win situation either way. If you leave it at 50, it's going to overtrack EOTF, clip highlights more, and if you lower it, then you lose some of the impact. Color in game mode is not as accurate as it was last year, and after adjustments and calibration, last year you could get it to a pretty reasonable level. This year, I would say you can only get it maybe to an acceptable level. LG's out-of-the-box accuracy is actually excellent this year, especially with the improvements to coming out of black. There's very little, if any, crushing at all. The target for their white point is D65, even on the C series, at least right now. Grayscale accuracy is fantastic for out of the box. The color is different this year, where it's not oversaturating red now. Nice improvements for accuracy if you like that. Also, LG has very many settings and options where if you're not worried about accuracy, you can make this way over brightened, and lots of levers that you can pull to make it to what you want, or you can calibrate it even further and make it an excellent tool for someone that really wants an accurate display or is using it for some kind of color grading work and so on. So while LG might still be using WRGB OLED in the C4 with no MLA, no heatsink, this is the biggest C-series upgrade since at least the C7, if not ever. There is a nice improvement in its overall performance as well as refinement in its tuning. So that's going to wrap up this comparison. Keep an eye out for individual reviews on these TVs and maybe them compared to other displays as well, like the S95D and the G4. Thank you all for watching. I hope to see you guys in those videos, and I'll talk to you then.